All right, can you guys hear me okay? Awesome. All right, so after a brief intermission, we have enough programmers in the room that we were able to figure something out. How's everybody doing? Good? Rested? Recharged? Slightly comatose from lunch? All right, I'll try and wake you up a little bit. I'm having a great time so far. It's awesome to meet a lot of you who, I'm playing the sort of pin the GitHub avatar on the real person's face game. So it's exciting to meet you in person. And I have to give some credit to some sage advice today. It's getting me through the day from my 2-year-old daughter. They were dropping me off at the airport yesterday, and I poked my head in the back seat to say goodbye to her, and she looks up at me with that really serious face that 2-year-olds can give you sometimes, and she says, "Don't fall down, Daddy." I was like, that's good, that's solid. I'm going to use that. So I haven't fallen down yet, and I'm going to see if I can make it through the next 15, 20 minutes without doing that. So, all right, so that's my face in case you're in the corners and you can't see it. It's up there on the slides. I'm Dave Wasmer. I'm the head of engineering at Praxis, and today we are going to be talking about the near future of Ember is now. So in March of 2018, Tom and Yehuda, is Yehuda here? I saw him earlier. Yeah. Well, wherever they are. They took the stage, the main stage at EmberCamp and talked about building a better Ember and fewer concepts, latest JavaScript, and a lot of features they talked about. And sort of the twist of the presentation was half those had shipped in stable already, which was a pretty awesome thing to see. But a lot of them hadn't yet. A lot of them were still forward-looking. So the goal for this talk is pretty short. We're just going to basically say 6 months later, how are we doing? Where are those at? And check in on those. So there's a few different sort of categories I'll lump them into. Some of these are complete, and when I say complete, I mean like documented, is default enabled, shipped in stable, is the standard Ember experience now. Partially available is not fully implemented, or it's behind a flag or in Canary or something like that. In progress is you can't really use it that much today, but code is being written. And design/planning stage is basically we haven't written any code yet. We're still figuring out what it is that we're going to build. And to steal a concept or a slide from Tom's deck earlier, everything here is going to be unstable, or not everything, but most things will be unstable, canary, experimental, use at your own risk. These are really cool and exciting features. I don't know if I would go build an entire business on the back of some of these just yet. We might want to wait a little bit longer until they're a little solidified. All right, so buckle up because I have about 30 slides to get through in less than 15 minutes. So I'll try and talk fast. The first is new file layout, also known as module unification. What is it? It's a new folder structure for how you structure your Ember applications. So it's a new way to organize components and templates and services and all the files that we use. It adds a lot more robustness and sort of explicit rules and naming structures that allows us to do some really cool things under the hood eventually. It unlocks a lot of doors. But in terms of the feature itself, if you're using a module unification app, if you're writing one, the biggest changes you'll notice are the new folder structure, as well as you'll tend to have to be more explicit about where your code's coming from. So if you're using a component previously that was supplied by an add-on, it might have just been magically available wherever you wanted it in sort of this global namespace. Module unification basically requires now that we be more explicit about where that's coming from. So we actually say, bring in this component from this add-on so it's clear about which one you're using. The status of module unification is it's partially available. So it's behind feature flags, which we'll talk about in a second, environment variable flags. There's a few things that are still in progress. So as of right now, there's some performance improvements and benchmarking that needs to happen. There's a few sort of edge cases, caveats that aren't handled 100% yet. So dummy apps are sometimes being falsely detected as module unification apps when they're not. Not all the generators have been updated. Most of the main ones you use every day have, but like instance initializers, for example, that generator hasn't been updated to support module unification layout yet. If you're using a really old version of the Ember CLI on a module unification app, it might blow up. Not terribly surprising there, but it would be good to gracefully handle that. And then there's some tricky edge cases around interop. So if you have a module unification add-on and a classic structured app, that might not play well. So still figuring some of those out. But if you want to try and use it today, you can run basically all of your Ember commands on the latest Ember CLI with these two environment variables flipped on. Those are a mouthful to type out. So I found myself getting quickly frustrated. And you have to run every command with those flags, not just Ember new. So when you run Ember server, you have to type that out. So I ended up just doing this quick and dirty hack of adding a script to my package JSON that includes those environment variables, and then you can just say yarn or npm run Ember, and then it's the usual stuff. All right, one down. Let's keep moving. Testing improvements. So this is basically async await in your tests and using non-jQuery helpers. So the idea was the non-jQuery helpers, a lot of people use jQuery to simulate events in their testing. So you'd say, $.foo click, and that would simulate a click event, and you can move through your acceptance tests that way. In order to remove jQuery from the equation as a requirement, you have to replace those kinds of operations with native helpers from the framework. And obviously using async await is pretty awesome. If you haven't yet, you should try it. That's what it looks like in practice. So rather than having the and then, you simply just add awaits in front of any of the asynchronous steps in your test, and then you can just assert at the end. The status for this one is complete. This is awesome. So this is available right now in stable. And what's really cool is actually as of 3.4, you can use async await in your app code as well. You actually no longer strictly need RSVP promises because Ember's promise run loop system is now aware of native promises, which means we can use async await in our app code, which is pretty awesome. I'm excited for that.
Yeah!
Skeptical? Is that true? Fact checking? All right. Robert's fact checking me here, so all right. Yeah, we'll skim over that.
And there's some run loop details.
Shh. All right. Named imports. So importing only what you need from the Ember framework. So it's pretty familiar syntax at this point for most people. Using this named import syntax, we can say that we want to take just the computed function or some specific class out of Ember, not the entire monolithic framework, and bring everything else along with it type of thing. This is really cool. I mean, the syntax itself is nice because it's a little bit more readable. You get sort of the intent out a little better. But what's really cool about it is it unlocks the possibility down the road of tree shaking. So we can now determine what parts of the framework you're actually using and what parts you aren't, and potentially drop those parts that you aren't from the bundle that ships to production. So that'd be pretty awesome. The status of this is partially available. So the named import syntax itself has been around for a little while. That's pretty standard now. But the tree shaking itself, that part is still experimental and in progress. So there's an add-on Ember CLI rollup packager you can try out. You need to read the README. There's some caveats and some setup instructions and that kind of thing. But it's worth a shot if you're interested in trying to potentially shave some size off of your payload. All right, native classes. So everybody's probably familiar with ember.object as sort of the base class for pretty much everything in your Ember application. That came about because when Ember first came out with that idea, there was no class syntax in JavaScript. There was none of this stuff. So we needed our own custom object model to support the kinds of cool things you could do with Ember. But now that JavaScript syntax itself has kind of caught up, it's time for us to figure out how we can ditch our custom implementation and try to use more native solutions that work across the entire ecosystem. So in practice, that looks like doing things like using actual class syntax rather than the custom extends method that you see on your Ember classes. The status of this one is partially available. So native classes do work. You can use them today. There's just a couple caveats. So the first is that observers and events don't work as intended. So the way that you use computed properties, for example, with native classes, you have to use decorators because the syntax for native classes doesn't let you assign a method to a computed value or something.
Observers and events work in 3.4.
Oh, they do? With the decorators? Oh, awesome. All right. Well, scratch that then.
But don't use them anyway.
Yeah. Tom was saying you shouldn't use them anyway, in case anybody didn't hear that. So there's a few special properties as well that you might not expect that actually need decorators. So for example, class names. A lot of stuff around components that when you're dealing with modifying the component wrapper element, a lot of times you'll need to add special decorators to those because they're handled somewhat differently in Ember's custom object model. And so we need to tell Ember how to handle those differently in the native model. The other status here is there's an RFC that's open right now. So everything we've talked about so far is basically moving at a syntactic layer to the native JavaScript syntax, but it's still under the hood. You're still inheriting from ember.object. Like all that stuff is still there. there's an RFC that's in the design and planning stages right now, still open, to figure out how do we actually move away from ember.object itself, not just the syntax, but the base class. And it's an interesting proposal. It actually suggests that we don't have base classes, that we treat everything like delegates or like duck typing in a sense. So if it looks like a component and acts like a component, then treat it like a component. So in this case, you'd have did insert element and this.args and all the things that look like a component, but there's no base class you're extending from. Angle brackets, also known as pointy ember. I am in love with angle brackets. It's also probably the most self-descriptive name of any of these features. Angle brackets are angle brackets, like these ones right here. It basically means when you invoke a component, you replace the curlies with the angle brackets, so you also get the @ sigil and this.args in your components. It makes for, in my opinion, much more readable templates because you can differentiate between control flow statements like if or each and HTML or custom components, which will be inserting things into the DOM. This one is also complete, which I was like cheering at my desk in my office in my house when this happened. So 3.4 ships this natively. You don't need anything at all. You can just use it right out of the box. That's awesome. In 2.12 through 3.4 is supported via a polyfill add-on from the venerable Robert Jackson here. So just install that and you're good to go. One caveat that kind of surprised me, and I didn't realize it initially, so I thought I'd call it out, is that angle bracket components do not support nested component invocations. So if you have a component that's in a nested folder inside your components folder in your source tree structure, you won't be able to call that component using angle bracket syntax. And it should be pretty clear why. Like that slash looks an awful lot like a closing slash for an HTML tag, and that gets really tricky to parse and handle. So that might initially seem like kind of a big bummer. Like if you're like me, I like a lot of structure in my source code and the idea of like, oh, I have to have everything top level now. But this brings up sort of a good underlying theme for all these features, which is a lot of these things overlap and produce something that's greater than the sum of their parts. So this seems like a big bummer, but when you use angle bracket components in a module unification app, you actually don't need the nested path structure when you try to call components. Because of the way components are looked up under module unification, it sort of starts with like a local first resolution. And so you find that you actually don't need this at all. And so it's a good sort of thing to realize that a lot of this stuff has that ability where by itself it's a cool feature, add it with another feature, and suddenly you have something much bigger, a different way of programming. Named blocks, also known as named yields, named slots, block slots. It's basically like a combinatorial matrix of the words named, slots, blocks, and yields. It's got like a million names. What is it? So if you want to pass multiple blocks into a component, basically. So in this case, we've got a modal component that has a header region and a body region that it wants to be able to let you put some output into. So you can pass in multiple blocks that are named so it knows where to fill in those slots inside its own component. This one is still in the design and planning stage. The original RFC for it was merged last year, but, and this is sort of the downside of my last comment about all these things adding up to something more. Sometimes all these things add up to more complexity. So this was merged, so RFC is complete, but now there's some new implications around how we deal with this and angle bracket components at the same time. And so that's thrown a little bit of a wrench in it, and so still trying to figure out some of those details. So still on the planning board. All right, so that was all the things that were addressed as sort of future-looking things from the keynote in March. This is the bonus round, so things that have started since that keynote in March that weren't addressed then. Semantic test helpers. This is a really cool idea, I think. It's an open RFC right now, so feel free to dive into the discussion. But it's the idea of using semantic accessibility-based selectors in tests rather than CSS. So there's a few add-ons that do something similar-ish, like test selectors, where you add test-only data attributes to your elements so that you can target them in your tests without coupling your tests to your CSS layer. But this sort of takes it a step further and says, well, that's really just all about a machine reading your interface to run your tests for you. That's also kind of what accessibility is all about, is having a machine-understandable interface. So rather than using CSS selectors like .login-email, just use the label for that field in your tests, and it kind of forces you to write accessible semantic markup. as you go. So that's a pretty cool concept, I think. The RFC is opened in April. Discussion's still going, so dive in. And the last one, which I have a slight horse in this race, is additions. So this is also known as what every other framework uses major releases for. An addition is a new release concept that's been proposed to mark a change in Ember's overall programming model. So when we talk about all these features adding up to some that's greater than their parts, right, when we have enough of those features land and we have sort of a sea change in how we think about programming in Ember, then we would use something like an addition to mark that point in time, rally everybody around updating documentation and add-ons, as well as making training material easier. There's a whole host of things that go into this. That RFC was opened earlier this month, and discussion's also still ongoing there. So that's the end of the bonus round. I'd say that the near future of Ember looks very bright. I'm really excited. Once all this stuff's landed, it's going to be like dealing with a new framework that I still know and love. There's one thing I came out of this process of preparing for this talk with. Sort of my takeaway lesson here is that we need to do maybe a better job showing this. This was actually like 2 days of work for me to dig through this relatively short list of features and compile their current status. And so if you're not somebody who is necessarily up to date on every, well, now Discord channel, it can be a little bit challenging to figure out what the status of these is. And you hate to bug. I resisted bugging Robert and everybody who's working hard on these features because I know that they're busy. But at the same time, it's a little bit challenging to find some of this information. So hat tip to Nullvox, Populi, and Needbe. They both wrote great blog posts within the past month that addressed various parts of this, how to write basically bleeding edge Ember. So I think we can do a lot more of that as a community. And then shameless self-promotion at the end, I'm hiring. So if you're interested, talk to me. That's all I got. Yeah. Thank you.